Yeah, this is Seymour Rocks reporting from down under. Uh, this is the most significant headline of any that I've seen. Oh God, I don't know. Um, Turkey to halt military operations against Kurds in North Syria. Ceasefire uh, will last 120 hours. And of course, being so important, I couldn't find a single hint of it on the Radio New Zealand website. I haven't looked further, so that's their priorities. So let's just. I think that the volume's going to be pretty bad, but anyway.
Today, the United States and Turkey have agreed to a ceasefire in Syria. The Turkish side will pause Operation Peace Spring in order to allow for the withdrawal of YPG forces from the safe zone for 120 hours. All military operations under Operation Peace Spring will be paused, and Operation Peace Spring will be halted entirely on completion of the withdrawal.
Mike Pence was speaking after talks with the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He said there will be no further U.S. sanctions on Turkey over the offensive. Pence added that once a permanent ceasefire is in effect, the restrictions imposed on Ankara over its military action will be withdrawn. Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu confirmed Ankara has agreed to temporarily halt its offensive in Syria.
PKK-YPG'nin 120 saat
will pause Operation Peace Spring in order to allow for the withdrawal of PKK and YPG forces from the safe zone. We have agreed on the collection of heavy arms from YPG and destruction of the positions and fortifications. The full agreement has been reached for Turkish forces to control the safe zone.
In a Twitter post, the Turkish president hailed the agreement, expressing confidence it will promote peace and stability. He made the comments in response to the U.S. President Donald Trump's earlier post, in which he welcomed the deal as great news.
Okay, so that's that. So that is the closest that I have seen to a total capitulation of the United States in anything since the fall of Saigon in 1975. And I heard a press conference yesterday with Donald Trump where he sounds much more like his old self. I don't know what he's done. He's managed to find his way around the deep state and his Israeli partners, and I really do suggest that you listen to the entirety of coverage from TruNews. I'll put the link below. But what has actually been agreed to? So what I picked up from Trump, if he's speaking the truth, of course, is that it involves a number like 28 troops or special forces that were based in the north of Syria. Now there's also a base at El Tumph in southeast Turkey near the oil fields, and it's quite clear, even though it's not mentioned by anybody, that Syria is not going to sorry, not Syria, America is not going to renege on that. So yeah, so here we are. This is from Master News. I always depend on the regional news most of all. The US Armed Forces are not withdrawing from the eastern Euphrates River Valley region of Deir ez-Zor or its plethora of oil fields, a military source in Damascus told Master News. So that's different from El Tumph again. So according to the source, the United States will not withdraw from these areas because of Iran's presence in eastern Syria and the reality that Damascus would again have access to Deir ez-Zor's vital oil fields. So, yeah, that's basic. That's the basic background to this. So, there's the TruNews people did an interview this morning with SyrianGirl, which I find highly significant. So I'm posting that directly after this.
With this TruNews special report, I'm Edward Zoll. The country of Syria hasn't known a day of peace in over a decade. A ruthless proxy war has been waged in the land which once hosted the first-century Christian churches of Antioch and Damascus, and served as the birthplace of the Gentile expansion of Christianity detailed by Luke in the book of Acts. Since the spring of 2011, Western armed jihadist mercenaries have salted the earth with blood, raping and pillaging the Syrian people, and transforming their rich countrysides of farmland and oil reserves into fields of destruction and death. Marauding under the various clandestine conceived banners of ISIS, ISIL, Tahrir al-Sham, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, the Kurds, the supposed Free Syrian Army, these monsters have laid siege to the popular elected government of Bashar al-Assad. But neither he nor the Syrian people have buckled. And we are now faced with a stalemate as the players in this chess game of conquest, including but not limited to Russia, the United States, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, seek to clear a path forward in a country which doesn't belong to them, while also maintaining territorial gains and strategic outposts seized throughout the conflict. Joining me to discuss this multinational mess is geopolitical analyst Maram Sousli. Ms. Sousli, known for her Twitter handle, SyrianGirl, has been at the forefront of exposing the propaganda and lies surrounding the alleged Syrian civil war, from the fake gas attacks to the Judas tears now being shed by neocons, neoliberals, and evangelical Zionists. Born in Damascus in 1987, Ms. Sousli currently lives in Australia and joins us now. Welcome to TruNews, Ms. Sousli.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure to finally get to talk to you. To start, Ms. Sousli, since our audience is new to you, would you mind giving us a brief background of who SyrianGirl is and why your analysis and predictions hold weight?
As you said, I was born in Damascus to Syrian parents who, were born in Damascus and their parents before them. So basically, I lived the first few years of my life there, and even though my parents migrated to Australia, I would visit there frequently. Originally, my grandparents were influential in Syria. My grandfather was a general, but he actually was taken out of government by the Ba'athist coup. So traditionally, because my family is a Sunni Muslim family from that level of society in Damascus, they weren't necessarily pro-government. However, because of the supposed, freedom and democracy rebels that were trying to take over the government, trying to take over the country, when we all knew it was just the Muslim Brotherhood that was trying to impose their draconian laws against everyone who wouldn't follow their brand of Islam, I felt it imperative that I speak out. And I never really wanted to be a public figure because of all of the risks that it entails. But it was my duty to do so. But I've always been very political, and I was, protesting the Iraq War, and I basically knew what was happening very clearly, that this was an outside forces trying to destroy my country. And just from reading the news, you can really know what's happening. You can guess their steps from the Iraq War to now. And that's why I've been able to predict, that the U.S. was going to occupy Syria after taking away its chemical weapons, because that's what they did in Iraq. They never ever occupy a nation that has weapons of mass destruction.
So they followed a template.
That's why they have to disarm it.
Well, you're absolutely right. They follow a template, and you recognize this template. And something I found so interesting about your story is that, as you noted, you're not pro-Assad. As many of the establishment media would try to paint you, especially print outlets that have written about you in the past. You're not pro-Assad in the sense that your family was actually against Assad or the Assad family and the Ba'athist regime, but you became pro-Syrian. You're pro-Syrian people and against foreign regime change. Is that correct?
I'm absolutely for the Syrian people, for Syrian sovereignty. I mean, Assad, my family did go get deposed from the Ba'athist coup. So far, I've liked Assad's foreign policy. At the beginning, he was a reformist as well, which was interesting for a lot of people. It gave a lot of people hope. So, my family should be it's not benefiting anything. They're not Alawites, they're not Christians, they're not Druze, they're not one of these. They try to put you in a kind of a box of why you are pro-government, but I'm pro-Syria. I'm pro the Syrian military, the sovereign state, and I'm against the breach of the sovereignty and the honor of the Syrian nation. And that's what I'm about.
Well, speaking about the Syrian state, let's get right to what's happening there in the region. Now, right now, President Trump has deployed his Vice President, Mike Pence, his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and his National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, to the region to meet with, actually straight to Turkey, to convince President Erdogan to enact a ceasefire and end his invasion of northern Syria. Now, let's say Turkey does what it already has promised to do, which is continue its military push into the northern Syria until a roughly 20-mile safe zone spanning the entire 300-mile border between Syria and Turkey is established. What do you think will happen?
If Turkey goes ahead as planned, which I believe it will, I don't think any amount of talk is going to stop them, then there is a good outcome of that, which be that the U.S. soldiers have to withdraw, because they cannot get caught in the crossfire between two allies, supposedly, the Kurds and the Turks. And they can't fire back at the Turks. So, they would be basically used as human shields, just sitting there, not able to do anything but be human shields, which is what the neocons want them to be. The reason why the neocons want them to stay there, of course, is not about the Kurds necessarily. It's because they want to balkanize Syria and make sure the Syrian nation never gets control of its own oil resources, so it cannot rebuild itself and it cannot defeat Al-Qaeda in Idlib. So that's the purpose of the U.S. soldiers in the country, and you can see even in spite of pulling out of Manbij and all of these northern towns, they're still occupying the oil fields. So that's the humanitarian war that they're trying to keep the U.S. soldiers in. And as Turkey moves in, of course, the Kurds, they realize that the U.S. cannot do anything. They cannot stop the Turks. They cannot fight back against the Turks. They won't come to their defense. And they have now gone to the Syrian army for protection, which is the job of the Syrian army. It's the job of the Syrian army to protect all Syrians. It's not the job of the United States. So that's another good outcome, that now there's unity in Syria, and the Syrian army can take back territory which was occupied by the Kurdish militias that the U.S. backed.
Well, you look at the players you just announced here. You got Turkey, the Kurds, you got the Syrian army coming up, reportedly pushing north to protect civilians, but also, as you noted, reclaim territory now, which has been left open from this vacuum of both the U.S. troops withdrawing themselves and the Kurds even, let's say, abandoning some of their forward positions in the north. Is there a scenario where you could actually see the Turkish army engaging the Syrian army? Do you think Bashar al-Assad will actually fight a war against Turkey to push them out of the country? Or do you think some kind of deal might be struck between those two?
If it comes to war will be fought. It's the Syrian army hasn't had any qualms about engaging with Turkey in the past. They shot down a Turkish jet in 2013. In Idlib, there was Turkish garrisons that they surrounded to get past, and Turkey did nothing. So if it comes to war, they will fight. But I think that Turkey realizes that its biggest threat at the moment is the Kurdish militias. So if they can get the Syrian military to subdue them, potentially they could avoid more international condemnation and etc. by just allowing the Syrian military to take back those territories, which is, we hope Russia would help do that. And I think that's probably what's going to happen.
Well, you've noted Russia, because Russia has moved in, and obviously in the peace process, if there has been a peace process, we can call it as such, to try to resolve what's been happening in Syria, the balkanization, as you referred to it. We look specific. You mentioned Idlib. Now, Idlib is interesting. I don't think a lot of the audience realizes this, but Idlib is still a territory that's held by terrorists. Right? These are terrorists that both the U.S. and Turkey has, in a sense, stopped the Russians and the Syrians from eradicating or pushing out of Idlib. But how does what's happening in Idlib right now affect what's happening on the border with Turkey? Do you believe that the current campaign to resolve what's happening with Turkey is going to take troops away from the stalemate in Idlib?
That's a very interesting question. I think, a lot of the militias that were fighting in Idlib are now fighting against the Kurds in the northeast of Syria. And it brings up a very complex position for the neocons in the United States, because they've been telling us that these Idlib terrorists are freedom fighters and they're fighting against Assad, and we need to help them and arm them. They've been arming them, they've been training them. They've been conducting bombing campaigns for them. And now suddenly, because they're fighting their Kurdish proxies, suddenly they're monsters and they're Arab militias and they're criminals. And what's going to happen when the Syrian military goes into Idlib? What kind of propaganda are they going to feed people? Are they going to abandon their position on those individual militias in Idlib? Because they were conducting beheadings too, not that your media ever talks about that. So I think that at the end of the day, Turkey intends to use Idlib and any territory that it takes as a bargaining chip to gain some kind of influence or foothold in Syria. But, as we've seen from the start of the war, the Syrian state is extremely independent and they're out for total victory. So there's not going to be anything less than total victory at the end of the day, including going into Idlib.
Well, as I mentioned, President Trump included Secretary Pompeo in his delegation to Turkey. But on his itinerary, there's an interesting stop planned, and it's in Jerusalem. Not just Ankara, he's going to Jerusalem. According to the State Department, he will meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to discuss, quote, developments in Syria and the continued need to counter the Iranian regime's destabilizing behavior in the region, end quote. Can you translate that for me? Why is America's Secretary of State visiting Israel? And how does Israel factor into Syria, and more specifically, the plight of the Kurdish militias that you've mentioned here?
Absolutely. The entire war was done for Israel. Israel had... The reason why the United States is enemies, as Trump said, with Syria is over Israel. Israel wants to occupy Syrian territory, not just the Golan Heights. They already occupied the Syrian Golan Heights. But they also have eyes for everything from the Nile to the Euphrates. And people think that this is ridiculous because they don't have the population. But, people in 1920 probably thought the concept of Israel was ridiculous and it was never going to happen. But they made it happen. And these are the words of Ben-Gurion, the first president of Israel himself, that our future generations must fight from everything from the Nile to the Euphrates. And if you notice, the U.S. And its allies, they don't care whatever happens to the Kurds west of the Euphrates. When Afrin was invaded, they asked them to pull out of Manbij, they asked them to pull out of Afrin. There wasn't this media outcry. But the minute that Turkey didn't invade just the west but began invading the east, suddenly the media's gone berserk. And that's because it's gone against Israel's Oded Yunon plan, their strategy for creating a Kurdistan out of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And in that way, they create an ally in the region. They can have U.S. military bases there, and they can destabilize and have other people fight amongst each other, and especially deny Syria its oil fields. and its water and a lot of resources that are in those territories. But the problem they had was that the Kurds population in Syria is quite small. It's only 1.5 million compared to like 22, 23 million. And where they're located, they're not one continuous block, they're discontiguous. And they are most of them actually were on the west side of the Euphrates, not even the east side. Afrin was the most densely populated Kurdish area in Syria. And there's no Kurdish population inside the oil fields. So this thing that they wanted to create, wanted to create a Kurdistan east of the Euphrates, it really wasn't that viable to begin with, and they struggled to keep it, and this Turkish invasion has made it collapse. But I think I want to get to as well, if you can, we can talk about that next, is a lot of the propaganda that you guys are being told about the Kurds and their national struggle. And as Trump said, they are no angels, and I want to explain exactly what he meant by that.
Well, go ahead. Let's talk about why President Trump mentioned there are no angels. He said there's no angels in the region, but specifically, he pointed out the Kurds are no angels. What have you found, Miriam? What did you share with our audience?
Sure. I mean, at the beginning of the war, I was probably just as naive as the rest of the world in that I bought into the line that there was a country called Kurdistan that Sykes-Picot divided amongst 4 nations, and they've been fighting for their national liberation ever since. But upon, and it's shocking that even I would have believed that, except for doing some research and realizing, wait a minute, east of Turkey used to be Armenia. The north of Iraq used to be Assyria and was for 5,000 years, and Assyrians still lived there. I mean, Syria's Qamishli, Syria has existed for 10,000 years. And the city of Qamishli, which is like what's supposed to be the capital of the Kurdistan that they're trying to create, was founded by the Assyrian Christians. And the Assyrians are like a ethnic group in northeast Syria that happens to be Christian, that, they are one of the oldest, and they still speak Aramaic. They speak Eastern Aramaic. So at the moment, like, someone like Mike Pence is trying to exploit them and claim that, these people are under threat of the Kurdish invasion and we have to go in to protect these Assyrian Christians. But if you actually hear the words of the Assyrian Christians, they've been saying that the Kurds have been oppressing us. Since the Armenian genocide, they have been instrumental in wiping out our people because the Kurds took part in the Armenian genocide. The reality is, up until World War I, Kurds used to be nomadic. So they are Iranian originally, from Iran, and they came through to these countries like Anatolia, Assyria, Syria, Turkey, Armenia, following the Zagros mountain, tending sheep. And that's why they never had a state, because nomadic peoples don't settle in cities, they don't build houses, they don't have states. But the reason they stopped being nomadic was because of the Armenian genocide. Because when they took part in it, they actually were promised the houses of the Armenians that they pushed out.
When you say take part in it, what do you mean by take part in it? They were used by the Turks as soldiers, or as the people who rounded up the Armenian Christians?
Yes, they were. In fact, they may have been even the spearhead of most of the genocide. This is all historical fact. Like you can look it up. They basically were the ones that did the deed. Turkey may have gave them the green light, but they did the Armenian genocide, and you can tell because there is a mountain called Ararat Mountain, which is very, very religiously significant for our Armenian people, because they say that Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark was supposed to have landed in that mountain, and yet the Kurdistan claims that mountain that used to be part of Armenia. So, like, when they're pushing the stuff, what is actually happening on the ground? The Christian schools have been shut down. They've been disarming Christian militias. They disarmed Christian militias in Iraq as well. And then the Kurdish militias pulled out and had ISIS just slaughter them and the Yazidis. This was in 2014. And they've been assassinating their leaders. And these Christians have been asking repeatedly for the Syrian military to come in, because they know that the pluralist government of Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'athists, they will maintain their security and they will allow them to continue. But the reason why the Kurds have been targeting them is because they are a reminder, a very visible reminder that they were not the original people that owned that land. That's why they want to wipe them out. Not to mention that Israel also has a thing against Assyrian Christians specifically, because they 5,000 years ago, apparently the Assyrians destroyed Judea. So they still have this like 5,000-year-old revenge. And that's why, the US hasn't even been told about the existence of the Assyrians up until a few days ago, when they had to be used for political reasons. And not to mention, Mike Pence talking about the Christians in the east of Syria, never cared about the Christians in the west of Syria, when those very same militias that are going into the east of Syria, the Free Syrian Army or the Syrian rebels, were destroying Christian villages and kidnapping nuns in the west of Syria.
Well, crucifying them, beheading and crucifying them. I mean, you're absolutely correct. The atrocities which took place in the west of Syria, especially between 2014, 2015, leading up to the 2016 election, there was absolute silence among many of the evangelical Zionists, as we referred to them here, like Vice President Mike Pence. And, the interesting thing with the Kurds, you mentioned a lot of interesting history already with them, but I've been finding that there's been a long relationship, a history of it at least, between Israel and this Kurdish group, Kurdish militias, those seeking to build Kurdistan. There's actually a report in the Times of Israel I have in front of me that a Kurdish lawmaker from the city of Qamishli, it's in the northwest of Syria. You might be able to pronounce it better than I can.
That's Qamishli, yes.
Qamishli. So he was actually on Israel's army radio, their military radio. And he was only named by the first Hebrew letter of his first name, which is Aleph. And he said, "We hope Israel will take action in the diplomatic arena to save the Kurdish people. If the problems aren't solved, the entire Middle East will be adversely affected." Now, Maram, what's so troubling about this is it appears that the Kurds are now actually directly reaching out for military assistance from Israel. We know in the past they've gotten training, reportedly weapons, especially support and air support from both the United States and reportedly Israel. But what would happen here if Israel stepped in to enforce this Kurdish claim to much of the fertile grounds of Syria?
Israel can't do much. That's why they're always trying to use the U.S. military as their attack dogs. I don't have any fear of Israel being able to achieve anything by itself. The only risk is that they force the U.S. military to maintain the state in Syria by using their diplomacy, which means AIPAC. So the thing is that in Iraqi Kurdistan, which of course occupies a lot of Assyrian land, and they've been ethnically cleansing them there, as well as other minorities, Arabs as well, have been ethnically cleansed. In Syria, Human Rights Watch even admitted it. So so they have a relationship with Israel already. And in the east of Syria, the YPG has been selling oil to Israel. That's been documented. So it's not a surprise to me that they've been doing that. Israel sees the Kurds there's a bizarre origin story that they have about the Kurds, about King Solomon. Apparently, like his genies married 500 beautiful Jewish women, and the offspring were the Kurds. That's their origin story.
Well, this sounds like some weird fairy tale. First of all, what is this? So this is a story that's being spread around, or this is an origin story that's actually being recited by both the Israelis and the Kurds?
I mean, it's on Wikipedia. Like, you guys can look at, you can see it yourself. That this is I guess I'm not sure that a lot of Jews actually believe this, but this is the origin stories that apparently Jewish people believe about the Kurds, that they really were born of King Solomon. I mean, I don't believe that. I believe that they were what historians say they were. Like, they were Iranian nomadic tribes. And Kurd, the word Kurd means tent dweller in Iranian, in Middle Persian anyway. But maybe that's what they've told their people in order to create some kind of mythology about these, the Genies and the Jews, and some kind of a bloodline connection, so that there's another reason to support them other than the Oded-Yunon plan and wreaking havoc in the Middle East, and destroying the historical Christian people there. So that's it. That's the story.
Well, okay, I want to delve in the story for a second. So you mentioned King Solomon. This has played a significant role for not just Israeli Zionists, but Christian Zionists and Freemasons. I mean, King Solomon is at the center of their doctrines, their claims to power, claims to territory, claims to rule. Now, you're saying here this fable. We'll look into this a little further. This fable claims that the Kurds are essentially a deep descendant of King Solomon, but specifically even originated from some kind of illicit marriage between genies, which would be considered both spiritually and mythologically as demons. I mean, there are demons. There can be, I guess, good and bad ones in that sense of the mythology there, but demons in the sense of spiritual context. And they had sex with 500 Jewish women. Is that the fable that's being passed around about the origin of the Kurds?
That's the fable. And genies are a fire being, so like demons. Yes, exactly. And the evil ones are called shaitan, like Satan. So they.
Maram, I grew up on London bridges burning down and Little Miss Muppet. Apparently, I must have missed this one. This is crazy.
Yeah, which, you guys would be interested because of genie energy. The Israeli oil and the
oil and gas, yes, Genie Energy in the Golan Heights.
In the Golan Heights.
With board members that are good friends with Mr. Epstein, or clients and friends and associates of Mr. Epstein and the mega group, as we've covered it on TruNews in the past. You're absolutely right. They used genie and the symbolism of genies. Makes you really wonder who these people really are and what their origins are, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, what crazy stories they have convinced themselves of and what they're trying to push here. But the most frustrating thing is when the Assyrian Christians are trying to make statements saying, like, no, Trump is right, they need to pull out, Pence is wrong, he's a hypocrite. They just completely ignore these people and they just pretend to care about Christians. In the meantime, Israel is like destroying churches and destroying Palestinian Christians, but then they always create some kind of puppet and they say, oh, this is the person that represents Christians in the Middle East. So that they can get away with it. And it's quite frustrating, really.
Oh, it's not just frustrating to you. I think it's frustrating to anyone in the world who is tired of seeing the propagandized images of Syrian children being bombed out or allegedly gassed, but more so, anyone in the world who cares about peace should care about the future of Syria because it's become the epicenter of the neocon, neoliberal, neo-evangelical Zionist push for a new war, a new World War III, some might call it, if we were to go war with Iran. But Maram, you have a record of correctly predicting how past developments in the region will play out. All right, I wanted to actually get your take on how does this all end? All right, how and what is the road to peace?
Sure thing. Well, if you look at the way that Israel is acting now, they are really in a panic. They have Nancy Pelosi jumping up and down. They have Lindsey Graham and they have Congress. They always had control of it anyway. So they are freaking out about Trump's decision, which I was surprised with Trump because he has kind of been like falling over backwards for Netanyahu, given Kushner. Maybe he just, isn't as controlled as someone like Hillary Clinton, who has been trained for this her whole life. And he doesn't want to have U.S. soldiers be acting as human shields. It is a surprise, but I don't think he's helped them in this at all. I think maybe he's given them enough rope to hang themselves with in some of the actions that he's taken. So they are very, very angry, and that tells you that the future is not going to be good for Israel because Syria and Iran are now in a much stronger position, Russia too. The Christianity has not been wiped out as they wanted, especially through the Iraq war and the war in Syria. So they cannot, and now a lot more people know the truth than before. So I think what's going to happen is that, yes, Syria will take back all its territory. It's going to be a struggle to rebuild given the US sanctions on Syria, but eventually they will. And possibly there's either going to be a war between Israel and Syria, or if they come to their senses and stop trying to create a Jewish state in the Levant and perhaps choose a pluralist government, then peace can reign. But that seems unlikely at this point.
Well, Maram, real quick, you mentioned rebuilding, and I've always wondered this. I know that the Chinese, with their One Belt, One Road initiative, it actually comes through Syria, through to the port of Tartus and other ports in the region, the port of Haifa in Israel. Who pays for this? Do the Chinese pay for the rebuilding? Do the Russians? Do the U.S.? Who do you think will ultimately fit the bill? Will it be the Syrian people?
Well, I think part of it, yeah, will be the Syrian people, but I think that we don't have any money at the moment, so it's going to have to be Russia and China doing it. China will rebuild Syria, as far as I understand. They can rebuild, they can build cities in a day in China, and the population of Syria, 20 million, is like one Chinese city. So I think that they should be very fine with doing that. There shouldn't be a problem. The issue will be that Syria has always been self-reliant. They follow the principle of self-sufficiency. But of course, we're not an island, so it's going to be difficult with the sanctions to rebuild. But hopefully, if a new government can take power in the U.S., maybe the sanctions will be removed.
Well, Maram, it has been a pleasure speaking to you today, and thank you again for your time. And I'm sure this won't be the last time we bring you on to True News.
Thanks a lot, guys. I hope so.